Hey everyone, this is a piece from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Text of Critical Marxism, Volume 2, The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism. This piece is titled, or labeled as 1939 Trotsky and His Critics by Max Shachtman. It's from 1962. What distinguished Trotsky from all other opponents of the Stalinist regime was his theory that it represented a bureaucratically degenerated worker state. Why was it still a worker state even after the opposition representing the revolutionary proletariat had in the late 1920s been driven out of the ruling party and into prison and exile, even after the consolidation of an exclusive bureaucratic monopoly in the party and state? Because first, there was still the possibility of defeating the bureaucracy by means of vigorous but peaceful reform of the party. And second, the principal means of production were still nationalized in the hands of the state, and yet not yet converted into private capitalist property. While the bureaucracy had betrayed the principles of the revolution, it had not yet surrendered this vital material achievement, nationalized property, to bourgeois counter-revolution. The latter was moving rapidly forward under the regime of the bureaucracy, but it had not yet triumphed. In no circumstances should it be allowed to triumph. Therefore, whenever and wherever there was an attack by bourgeois forces on the Stalinist regime, which for all its degeneration remained a worker state, it was the duty of the Trotskyists and workers throughout the world to stand up for the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. In sum, Stalinist bureaucracy was paving the way for a counter-revolution in Russia. A timely victory of the opposition would restore the state to Soviet democracy and internationalism. The vacillating parasitic bureaucracy was not a serious alternative. The alternative was the victory of the counter-revolution. Its social content was bound to be the restoration of private property following the destruction of nationalized property. Proletariat and bourgeoisie were the only two basic and decisive classes. The issue would be joined and determined in open conflict between them, and that conflict was imminent. Up to that moment, even the degenerated Stalinist state must be defended against bourgeois attack. ... So this is probably an abridged piece if there's the ... Banished from the territory of the Soviet Union by police decree at the end of 1928, Trotsky only intensified his war upon the Stalinists upon the basis of this doctrine, analysis, and program. Trotsky was now able for the first time to assemble and lead an international communist opposition based entirely on his theory. But Trotsky soon found that he had to defend this theory almost as often and as vehemently from his partisans as from his enemies. From the time of his banishment until his tragic death, there was hardly a year in the existence of the Trotskyist movement abroad, or of its counterpart inside Russia, so long as it retained any sort of coherent and articulate form, that did not see a crisis that rent its ranks in disputes over Trotsky's views of the, quote, Russian question, unquote. There was hardly a year of his last exile when Trotsky did not find himself obliged by new developments or by reconsideration to modify his theory, sometimes drastically, while trying to preserve its essentials. The last year of his life saw another crisis occurring at the outbreak of the World War. His position on Russia was again challenged by his followers. In this last controversy, he allowed for an amendment to his conceptions so far-reaching in its implications as to shatter the very basis of his theory, in particular the theory of his opposition to Stalinism. Even before Trotsky was banned to Turkey, the process of disintegration of the Russian opposition had begun, and it continued at an accelerated pace. The democratic centralist, residual faction in the controversies of the early 1920s, which had joined with Trotsky and Zinoviev in the United Opposition Bloc of 1926, were the first to part with their allies. Led by old Bolshevik militants like Sapronov and Vladimir Smirnov, they took the view that the Thermidorian reaction, the counter-revolution, had already triumphed in Russia, and that the workers' state was at an end. Relatively, this was a minor loss. Graver ones soon followed. In the middle of 1928, with all the oppositionists already expelled, it became evident that a new struggle was developing among anti-Trotskyist leaders, precipitated by a crisis in grain collections. Now the fight was between Stalin's followers and those led by Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky. It was the prelude to what was to be called the, quote, Great Change, end quote, or quote, Russia's second revolution, end quote. The program of massive industrialization and forced collectivization, which was to be the decisive feature of Russia's development for the next 3 decades. Trotsky, then in Asian exile, treated Stalin's turn with the greatest skepticism and reserve. Indeed, he sounded the alarm against the impending counter-revolution more vigorously than ever. Stalin, he wrote repeatedly in those days, and for a long time afterwards, had not adopted and could not adopt a left course, but only a, quote, left zigzag, end quote. He represented only the bureaucratic apparatus vacillating under the pressure of real and effective classes. Tomorrow the, quote, right tail, end quote, would come crashing down on his head because it represented the powerful restorationist and proprietor classes, and to them Stalin would capitulate. In a famous 1928 article, which was one of the pretexts for his expulsion from Russia, Trotsky insisted that the country was facing a, quote, dual power, end quote, situation, as it did in 1917 just before the Bolshevik victory, when Kerensky represented the state power of the bourgeoisie and the Soviets were the incipient socialist power. Only this time the, quote, film of October is unwinding in reverse, end quote. That is, it was not the bourgeois element of the dual power that was about to be overturned by the socialist element, but exactly the other way around. Voroshilov was even mentioned as the possible, quote, man on horseback, end quote, a counter-revolutionary Bonaparte. As late as April 1931, even though the right wing had already been crushed by Stalin, Trotsky still spoke of the, quote, dual power, end quote, in Russia, and declared that the further degeneration of the party machine, Stalin's faction, quote, undoubtedly increases the chances of the Bonapartist form, end quote, of the overturn of the Soviet state. That is, quote, the form of the naked saber, which is raised in the name of bourgeois property, end quote. Parenthesis, to my knowledge, he never again referred to the, quote, dual power, end quote, in Stalinist Russia, or to the outcome of the contest between the two classes it was said to represent. End parenthesis. This analysis was entirely in keeping with Trotsky's idea of expected developments, but it was almost equally out of keeping with the political and social reality. It cannot and did not serve to retard the decline of the opposition, upon which the Stalinist apparatus was in any case exerting an almost unbearable pressure. As it became clear that Stalin's course was not a, quote, zigzag, end quote, but a sustained and resolute line, that the Bukharin faction was irretrievably defeated, that the propertied, semi-propertied, and potentially propertied people in the country were being economically, parenthesis, and even physically, end parenthesis, annihilated, that a restorationist bourgeoisie was not within miles of a struggle for power, parenthesis, then or later, end parenthesis. The Zinovievist and then the Trotskyist opposition collapsed. First, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and their friends capitulated to the regime. Then of the Trotskyists came the capitulation of Radek, Preobrazhensky, and Smilga. Then, parenthesis, this was an especially hard blow to Trotsky, end parenthesis, Rakovsky, then dozens upon dozens, and finally hundreds of others. A tiny dwindling minority remained steadfast, and none of these survived the blood purges of the Moscow trials period, nor indeed did the capitulators. There's like a mini essay biography on Christian Rakovsky on this channel. In virtually every case, if we set aside exhaustion, apparatus, pressure, and the like, the political reason given was at bottom the same. The perspective of a rising bourgeois counter-revolution had proved to be false. If anything, Stalin was smashing the economic and political foundations of the bourgeois elements more ruthlessly than the opposition had ever proposed to do. And his economic policy was not a momentary tactic but a durable line by which he was expanding and consolidating the basis of socialism. In this, they had to work along with him. This reasoning was not without its defects. It is true that even the soundest theoretical and political arguments would have been of little avail in holding together the opposition in the extraordinary circumstances. It is true, too, that Trotsky's analysis, criticism, and predictions about the Stalinist course in a dozen vital fields of domestic and foreign policy were matchless and were confirmed by events. But in the basic theory that the bourgeois counter-revolution and the restoration of capitalism were on the order of the day in Russia, that the destruction of the economic and political power of the workers under Stalin was bound to bring about this counter-revolution, and this one alone, that the Stalinist bureaucracy could not effectively resist it, but only manure the soil from which it would surely arise, this theory found no confirmation at all. Yet Trotsky reiterated the analysis and forecast in a dozen different ways in all his writings during the critical decade of the 1930s. Emphatically and without reservation, from a mind so luminous and penetrating it is almost incomprehensible, unless we remember that it was a fixed point in Trotsky's doctrine. A worker state can be destroyed and replaced only by a bourgeois state based on private property. Outside Russia, the Trotskyist movement enjoyed far greater continuity and coherence, if only because it was free of the ruthless police pressures of the Kremlin. Trotsky never had to cope among his foreign supporters with the problem of capitulation to Stalinism or conciliation. Except for a few trivial individual cases, no such tendencies manifested themselves. But he was not free from the necessity of defending his views continually from doubts and challenges in his own ranks. It may be said that even those who accepted his theory, including the changes Trotsky introduced into it from time to time, did not always agree with the passionate enthusiasm and conviction they shared for his trenchant attacks upon the Stalinist regime and its policies. But Trotsky's prestige and authority in his movement were probably unequaled by the leader of any other branch of the radical movement. For most of Trotsky's followers, this sufficed to turn the balance against doubt, but not for all. Barely settled in his Turkish exile, Trotsky was forced into a sharp struggle with a large part, if not the majority, of his adherents in Europe. In the Russo-Chinese conflict in 1929, over the Chinese Eastern Railway, on which Moscow held important rights inherited from Tsarist times, a military clash appeared possible. This raised the question among the Trotskyists of the validity of the policy of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union in wartime, end quote. Many of them held that Moscow was displaying an imperialist attitude toward China and that revolutionists should not support it. Trotsky attacked them furiously. Russia was to be defended in spite of Stalin because it was still a worker state. The ensuing debate ended in the first big split in the Trotskyist movement. Most of the Germans followed their chief, Hugo Orbán's, in separating from Trotsky. In France, most of the communist syndicalists around Fernand Loriot and Pierre Manat, founders of the French Communist Party and partisans of Trotsky as early as 1924, broke with them in this dispute. So who were in the Trotskyist group led by Maurice and Madeleine Paz. The split extended to Belgium, where Trotsky lost the alliance of the group around Van Overstraeten, the former head of the Communist Party and then of the Trotskyist opposition. I'm going to look some of these people up just for old time's sake. I know who a lot of them are, but I just want a refresher. Hugo Orbán. Maurice Paz. Let me see. French Wikipedia says Maurice Paz, born on the 22nd of 1896 in Paris and died on November 24th in 1885 in the same city, was a French lawyer, historian, and politician, a founding member of the French Communist Party. He organized in 1924 with his wife Magdalena the first nucleus of French oppositionists, collaborated with Trotsky, then joined the SFIO, where he would be one of Paul Fouar's close friends. Magdalene Paz was a French journalist, writer, and activist in left-wing political movements and those defending human rights. She lived from 1889 to 1973. Okay, thank you. According to German Wikipedia on Hugo Urbans, it doesn't have like a overall biography, but I'm going to skip to the part that appears to be about the period we're concerned with here. You know what? Fuck it. I'm going to read the whole thing. It's only a couple paragraphs. Coming from a farming background, Hugo Urbans attended middle school and trained as a primary school teacher in Bad Segeberg and Tondern, where he was still part of the German, which was still part of the German Empire at the time. Urbans then worked as a teacher in Schleswig-Holstein and Hamburg. Hugo Urbans, who had contacts in socialist circles from 1912 onwards, initially volunteered for military service, but was later discharged due to tuberculosis. Radicalized by his wartime experience, Hugo Urbans joined the Spartacus League in Hamburg, and after its founding, the Communist Party of Germany. In the Hamburg Party organization, Hugo Urbans belonged to the small minority that did not join the Communist Workers' Party, the Left Communist Party, after 1920. Urbans, who was also a delegate at the Unification Party conference of the KPD and USPD Linke, which I guess means USPD, Independent Social Democratic Party Left, formed the inner leadership of the Hamburg KPD from 1921 to 1924, amongst others with Ernst Thälmann, who came from the USPD, which also represented in Hamburg, who he also represented in the Hamburg Parliament from 1921, where he soon became known as a sharp-tongued speaker. Hugo Urbans belonged to the left wing of the party, but unlike most KPD leftists, he did not reject cooperation with the SPD in concrete actions. During the Hamburg Uprising of 1923, in the preparation of which Urbans was centrally involved, Hugo Urbans acted as political leader and as link between the political and military leadership of the uprising, and had to go into hiding after the uprising failed. From the underground, Urbans criticized the fact that the party leadership around Heinrich Brandler and August Thalheimer had not supported the action of the Hamburg KPD by organizing uprisings in other regions. When Urbans gave a speech at a memorial rally in honor of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in early 1924, he was arrested. Although Urbans had been elected to the Reichstag in May 1924, Urbans remained in prison until October 1925. In January 1925, Urbans was sentenced to 10 years in prison as the main defendant who accepted full political responsibility for the Hamburg uprising during the trial. Finally, due to his parliamentary immunity, Hugo Urbans resumed his political activity in the Reichstag and in the KPD Central Committee, to which he had been elected in absentia in July 1925. In the factional struggles, Urbans was one of the most prominent spokesmen of the left wing alongside Ruth Fischer and Arkady Maslow, and began to criticize the developing Stalinist general line of the party and the Comintern. In 1926, Urbans was expelled from the KPD. An attempt to show solidarity through the declaration of the 1000 was unsuccessful. Urbans moved to Berlin and became a leading representative of the parliamentary group of left communists, the left opposition in Germany, and played a key role in founding the Lenin League, which he headed from 1928 to 1933. In 1929/30, Urbans broke with Leon Trotsky after Trotsky vehemently criticized Urbans' view that the Soviet Union was moving towards capitalism and pursuing an imperialist policy towards China. From 1929, Urbans' main focus was on creation of an anti-fascist united front against National Socialism. After the Nazi Party seized power in 1933, Urbans, who had sharply attacked the National Socialists on several occasions in the years before, was forced to flee abroad. On the 29th of March 1934, the German Reichsanzeiger published the second expatriation list of the German Reich, through which he was expatriated. After a brief stay in the Czechoslovak Republic, Urbans was able to settle in Sweden, where Urbans had to make a living as a woodworker and printer under sometimes poor conditions and tried to maintain the exile structures of the Lenin League. From 1936 to 1938, during the Moscow trials, which Orban sharply attacked, the Soviet embassy in Stockholm under Ambassador Alexander Kollontai tried to have Urbans expelled from Sweden, which could only be averted because no other country wanted to accept Urbans. After the end of the Second World War, Urbans refused to return to Germany. Okay, so that's Hugo Urbans. What else did I want to look up? Ferdinand Loriot. Ferdinand Loriot, born October 10th, 1870 in Saintonge in Orne and died on October 12th, 1932 in Paris, was a French teacher, unionist, socialist, and communist. I'm not going to read more than that. Pierre Monat lived from 1881 to 1960 and was a French trade unionist, founder of the Confédération Générale du Travail, CGT, General Confederation of Labor, at the beginning of the 20th century, and founder of its journal La Vie Ouvrière, Worker's Life, on the 5th of October 1909. Monat has been considered one of the great figures of revolutionary syndicalism. It says that in 1923, Monat joined the French Communist Party, PCF, and was close to Boris Souvarine and Alfred Rosmer. Along with them, Monat was excluded at the end of 1924 of the party at the occasion of an internal purge against the left opposition of the party, which supported Leon Trotsky. Then, Monat founded in 1925 the journal La Révolution Prolétarienne, the Proletarian Revolution, along with Robert Luzon. The journal enjoyed an appreciated audience among trade unionists and left-wing activists during the interwar period. What else? And Van Overstraeten. Shit. Come on. Edward Var, Van Overstraeten, lived from 1891 to 1981. Overstraeten was a Flemish communist activist and painter. He is one of the founders of the Communist Party of Belgium. At the end of the First World War, Van Overstraeten was a member of the Young Socialist Guard. In 1920, Van Overstraeten attended the Second World Congress of the Comintern, where he defended left communist positions. Van Overstraeten participated in the founding of Comintern. Overstraeten also attended the Third World Congress of the Comintern in 1921, where he was elected to the Executive Committee of the Communist International. In 1923, Overstraeten was imprisoned for 4 months for his opposition to the occupation of the Ruhr. In 1925, Van Overstraeten was elected as a communist deputy to the Belgian Chamber of Representatives. However, in 1927, Van Overstraeten organized a majority of the Belgian Communist Party in opposition to the expulsion of Trotsky and Zinoviev. Van Overstraeten was then purged in 1928 as a Trotskyist. Van Overstraeten remained active for a few years as a dissident communist before giving up political activity in the 30s. He subsequently focused on painting and retired to Bruges. So, alright, so here we are. Let me reread that sentence. Sorry for that, but I just wanted to, look up these people. Most of the Germans followed their chief, Hugo Orbans, in separating from Trotsky. In France, most of the communist syndicalists around Fernand Loriot and Pierre Monod, founders of the French Communist Party and partisans of Trotsky as early as 1924, broke with Trotsky in the dispute. So did many who were in the Trotskyist group led by Maurice and Madeleine, looked like it was spelled Magdalene, Paz. The split extended to Belgium, where Trotsky lost the allegiance of the group around Van Overstraeten, the former head of the Communist Party and then of the Trotskyist opposition. The split was a stiff blow, but under Trotsky's tireless hammering, the oppositional groups in Europe and the Americas, though they never became a political force, were reunited around Trotsky's views. The union did not endure. It was breached at first in a minor way during the period of the Moscow trials and the Spanish Civil War. After that time, Trotsky defended his theory that Russia was still a workers' state on the grounds that the workers retained the possibility of turning the political helm in Russia and returning the bureaucracy under their control and bringing the bureaucracy under their control, without resorting to a revolution by means of an internal reform of the ruling party. By 1936, he could no longer maintain this view and abandon it. It seems like Trotsky abandoned that view earlier, in 1933, at least to my understanding, the starting point of his view of his abandonment of reform of the Comintern, and the view no longer holding the view that the Bolshevik Leninists were a left opposition, but favored a political revolution against Stalin and the bureaucracy. That kind of change in position to those more radical positions about the USSR came with the rising to power of Hitler in 1933. I believe it was January 1933 that Hitler came to power. The bureaucracy had now, he argued, attained total political power. Indeed, in its political rule, it did not differ from the fascist bureaucracy in Germany. In fundamental distinction from the latter, however, it rested upon different social foundations, defined as nationalized property, which the Stalinist bureaucracy preserved, quote, in its own way, end quote, just as the Nazi bureaucracy preserved private property in its way. The Russian workers had been completely expropriated of all political rights and power, because the, quote, way, end quote, in which the bureaucracy defended nationalized property was such as to bring closer the return of capitalism. The bureaucracy had to be removed from political dominance, which had reached such a totalitarian level that it could not be corrected by peaceful reforms. The bureaucracy could be overturned only by a revolution, but this revolution would not be a social revolution, as it would not alter the prevailing property forms. It would be a, quote, political revolution, end quote. It's hardly necessary to dwell on the dimensions of the whole this thesis created in the wall of Trotsky's basic theory. Here it must suffice to refer to two reactions in the ranks of the Trotskyists. The vast majority in Europe and America accepted it out of hand, so to speak, with little reflection on its significance. Few recalled that only a little earlier Trotsky, both in exposition and in polemic, had insisted that Stalinist Russia was a worker state precisely because, while the bourgeoisie needed a revolution against the regime in its interest, the working class could realize its interest by means of peaceful reform. The other reaction was shown by those Trotskyists, a very small and ineffectual minority, who rejected Trotsky's thesis. One of them is the young Frenchman, Ivan Crépieux. In Russia, he wrote, the loss of all political power by the working class meant that it no longer ruled in any social sense, that Russia was no longer a worker state, and that the bureaucracy had become a new exploiting and ruling class. Furthermore, this new class, by its military alliance with French imperialism, in the form of the Stalin-Laval Pact, and by its role in the Spanish Civil War, where the Stalinists opposed all steps towards a socialist revolution and proclaimed themselves defenders of private property, ruled out for revolutionists the policy of the defense of the Stalinist Russia in a war. If you're interested, there was an article about Russia by Ivan Crépieux on this channel, which was featured in the book Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, edited by Haberkern and Lippau. The other was an American Trotskyist leader, James Burnham, a somewhat unorthodox Marxist who has later become more widely known in a different capacity. Leaning heavily on Trotsky's contention that the Russian working class had lost all trace of political power, Burnham argued that, though Russia was no longer a worker state, it was not yet a bourgeois state. The bureaucracy was playing a reactionary role because it had, quote, definitely entered the road of the destruction of the planned and nationalized economy, end quote. It expressed only the interest of those social groups that were, quote, now in the process of transformation of a new bourgeois ruling class, end quote. However, since nationalized property still existed, the defense of Russia in war was the, quote, imperative and inescapable duty, end quote, of the proletariat. This is in 1937. It did not even foreshadow the altogether different position Burnham was to take later. Trotsky's response was moderate, but clearly Burnham did not differ too widely from his own view. One element in Trotsky's reply is worth recalling, however, for the special light it throws on later development. Although in a certain sense Hitler and Stalin both served the bourgeoisie, quote, between the functions of Stalin and Hitler there is a difference. Hitler defends the bourgeois forms of property. Stalin adopts the interest of the bureaucracy to the proletarian forms of property. The same Stalin in Spain, that is, on the soil of a bourgeois regime, executes the function of Hitler, end quote. It was thus shown again, concluded Trotsky, that the bureaucracy was not an independent class, but, quote, but the tool of classes, end quote. A tool, parenthesis, a bad one, of the workers in Russia where state property prevailed, and a tool of the bourgeoisie outside Russia where private property existed. The 1937 dispute was allowed to lapse. Neither Crépieux nor Burnham pressed their views further, and Trotsky seemed content to let it go at that. The new doctrine of the political revolution became official, and in 1938 Trotsky added an amendment that the revolution, which was to restore the democracy of the Soviets, would exclude the bureaucracy from participating in them. 2 years later, the war broke out, and the conflict over the, quote, Russian question, end quote, flared up more intensely than ever before. It proved to be the most bitter and most racking of the internecine struggles of the Trotskyist movement, and the last one in which Trotsky was able to participate. The theory of, quote, unconditional defense of the, quote, workers' state, end quote, was given its crucial, indeed its only concrete political test with the firing of the first gun. The armies of Hitler and Stalin joined forces to conquer and subject Eastern Europe, to divide the spoils of victory. The annexation of the Baltic lands and parts of Poland and Finland was undoubtedly required for the defense of Stalinist Russia, in much the same way as the subjugation of Korea and Manchuria were required by Imperial Japan. But what had such a course in common with socialist politics, asked a minority of the American Trotskyist leadership? Their answer to this question was nothing. Russia was now an integral part of the imperialist war, allied with a reactionary imperialist power and pursuing with its ally an imperialist policy of conquest and oppression. Russia's invasion of Poland and Finland must be condemned, and the slogan of defense of Russia discarded. They did not advocate support of the Western coalition, which they characterized similarly as imperialist. The break with Trotsky's traditional policy was unmistakable and pretentious. The minority leaders included Martin Aberin and Max Shachtman, two of the founders of American communism, and two of the three communist leaders who launched the Trotskyist movement in the United States in 1928. Shachtman founded the Theoretical Journal of the American Trotskyist and edited Trotsky's works in English. The third, James Burnham, although a later adherent to Trotskyism, was widely respected in its ranks. The three could not easily be dismissed as casual figures. The American organization was by far the most stable, steadfast, and important branch of the international Trotskyist movement, and Trotsky could not let it depart from his position by default or negligible interventions. From Mexico he plunged into the debate. Although differing on the sociological question, the, quote, class character of the Russian state, end quote, parenthesis, Aberin believed that it was still a degenerated worker state. Burnham had abandoned that view in 1937, and Shachtman was uncertain, end parenthesis, which they agreed not to debate. The three were at one about the political question, quote, parenthesis, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, end parenthesis. It was perfectly obvious that analysis of the theoretical question was in itself far from being decisive in determining policy towards the war. Trotsky ignored the fact that it had only recently been just as obvious to him. And after starting out with a relatively mild article against the view of the minority, Trotsky launched a large-scale attack upon the minority, drawing on Trotsky's exceptional intellectual resources, which the minority could not match, and using Trotsky's unrivaled gift of irony. Trotsky blanketed his opponents under a mounting drumfire of polemic. They stood firmly by their position, even though Trotsky exploited its every weakness and gap, reassured by their conviction that he had not answered what was sound and rational in their rejection of, quote, defensism, end quote. A few weeks later, Trotsky expanded the range of his assault. Trotsky confronted the minority with questions ranging from the class nature of Russia to the logic of Aristotle and Hegel, from dialectical materialism down to the most trivial of internal organizational matters. Trotsky called into question the revolutionary probity of the minority leaders' personal characteristics, and the minority leaders' records in the movement. The minority leaders were denounced as a, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, suffering from, quote, gangrene, end quote. The political question, the only one posed by the minority, was all but lost in this universalized turbulence. With this kind of intervention from Trotsky, his supporters retained control of the American organization at the end of the dispute, but only by a narrow margin. The minority won the decisive majority of the young Trotskyists and almost half of the party membership as well. After the 1940 convention, the minority were expelled in block without trial, and split was irrevocable. Aber and Shachtman and their friends continued in a new organization. Burnham, deeply shaken and repelled by the fight Trotsky had conducted, quit the movement entirely with a disavowal of Marxism in general, and soon moved to the position presented a year later in the Managerial Revolution. The book. Trotsky's victory was as complete as it was dubious. From the vigor and intensity of his participation in the dispute, nobody could have imagined that he was at the same time in such despair about his personal condition that he was seriously contemplating taking his own life. Of this melancholy prospect there was not the slightest sign in his polemical writings. Yet, oddly enough, it was neither the direct targets of these writings, his party opposition, nor the arguments leveled against them that were the most important aspect of the development of Trotsky's theory in this last period of his life. From this standpoint, the fight against his own opposition was of decidedly secondary, at most of auxiliary significance. Primary importance belongs instead to Trotsky's critical observations on a theory put forward by a non-participant in the dispute. This is a former Italian communist and ex-Trotskyist who, on the eve of the war, published a book in French, La bureaucratisation du monde, under the name of Bruno Rizzi. If you're curious, I have a lot of pieces about Bruno Rizzi on this channel. Anyway, Rizzi rejected Trotsky's theory of the, quote, degenerated workers' state and held that a new revolution was taking place throughout the world. It had brought or was bringing to power a new ruling class and a new social order, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. It was neither capitalist nor socialist in any significant sense. The working classes were reduced to totalitarian slavery, exploited collectively by the new bureaucracy. The Stalinist bureaucracy in Russia and the fascist bureaucracy are equally representative of the supremacy of this new class and new social order. So too is the New Deal of Roosevelt, even if in a not yet equally advanced form. Thus also a little later, the Managerial Revolution, in which Burnham adopted Rizzi's thesis virtually in toto, and with the addition of some extravagant predictions. Up to the appearance of Rizzi's work, Trotsky defended his theory from those critics in or around his movement, except in the case of Crépieux, who held that the Russian state stood above the contending classes, or that it had become a bourgeois state, usually called, quote, state capitalism, end quote. Hugo Urbans, for example, put this label upon Stalinist Russia as well as upon Fascist Italy and Germany. In Marxian terms, and in terms of social realities, this label was an absurdity. Trotsky had little difficulty in ridiculing and riddling this point of view, and more generally in rejecting the identification of the Stalinist and Hitlerian social regimes despite the similarities of their political rule. Rudolf Hilferding, the eminent Austro-German socialist theoretician and economist who in 1940 linked fascism and Stalinism in the same social category of, quote, totalitarian state economies, end quote, likewise gave short shrift to the theory of, quote, state capitalism, end quote. A social order in which there is no capitalist class, no capitalist private property, no capitalist profit, no production of commodities for the market, no working class more or less free to sell its labor power on the market, can be described as capitalist no matter how modified by adjectives, only by arbitrary and meaningful definition. In any case, there was no capitalist class anywhere in the world who would accept such a definition. In Rizzi's case, Trotsky had a different problem. Trotsky did not hesitate to acknowledge the merits of Rizzi's work or to criticize what Trotsky called Rizzi's work's mistakes. But in acknowledgement and criticism, Trotsky managed to subvert the foundations of his own theory. This looks like a quote, but it doesn't really seem to be presented as such. Quote, Bruno R. in any case has the merit of seeking to transfer the question from the charmed circle of terminological copybook exercises to the plane of major historical generalizations. This makes it all the easier to disclose Rizzi's mistake. Bracket, he wrote on the 25th of November, Trotsky wrote on the 25th of September 1939, and bracket, Bruno Arros caught on to the fact that the tendencies of collectivism, bracket, operating in all modern economy in Russia, Germany, or the United States, and bracket, assume, as a result of the political prostration of the working class, the forms of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. The phenomenon in itself is incontestable, but where are the limits and what is its historical weight? End quote. The answer given by Trotsky to these questions were little less than startling in view of the tenacity with which Trotsky had till then clung to his own theory of Stalinism and the arguments he had mustered in support of it. 3 weeks later, 18th of October 1939, and Trotsky wrote, quote, some comrades evidently were surprised that I spoke in my article, the USSR in the war, of the system of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, as a theoretical possibility. They discovered in this even a complete revision of Marxism. This is an apparent misunderstanding. The Marxist comprehension of historical necessity has nothing in common with fatalism. Socialism is not realizable, quote, by itself, end quote, but as a result of the struggle of living forces, classes, and their parties. The proletariat's decisive advantage in this struggle resides in the fact that it represents historical progress, while the bourgeoisie incarnates reaction and decline. Precisely, and this is the source of our conviction in victory. But we have full right to ask ourselves, what character will society take if the forces of reaction conquer? I'm guessing this is a continuation of the quote. Marxists have formulated an incalculable number of times the alternative, either socialism or return to barbarism. After the Italian, quote, experience, end quote, we repeated thousands of times either communism or fascism. The real passage of socialism cannot fail to appear incomparably more complicated, more heterogeneous, more contradictory than was foreseen in the general historical scheme. Marx spoke about the dictatorship of the proletariat and its future withering away, but said nothing about bureaucratic degeneration of the dictatorship. We have observed and analyzed for the first time and experienced such a degeneration. Is this revision of Marxism? The march of events has succeeded in demonstrating that the delay of the socialist revolution engenders the indubitable phenomena of barbarism, chronic unemployment, pauperization of the petty bourgeoisie, fascism, finally wars of extermination which do not open up any new road. What social and political forms can the new, quote, barbarism, end quote, take, if we admit theoretically that mankind should not be able to elevate itself to socialism? We have the possibility of expressing ourselves on this subject more concretely than Marx. Fascism on one hand, degeneration of the Soviet state on the other, outline the social and political forms of neo-barbarism. An alternative of this kind, socialism or totalitarian servitude, has not only theoretical interest, but also enormous importance in agitation, because in its light the necessity for socialist revolution appears most graphically. End quote. Trotsky. What, quote, some comrades evidently were surprised, end quote, at, and not without What, quote, not that, what, quote, some comrades evidently were surprised, end quote, at, and not without cause, was the view Trotsky had set down in his article of the 25th of September 1939. It is worth citing, quote, might we not place ourselves in a ludicrous position if we affix to the Bonapartist oligarchy, bracket, the Stalinist regime, end bracket, the nomenclature of a new ruling class just a few years or even a few months prior to its inglorious downfall? Question mark, ... This is a continuation of the quote. The Second Imperialist War poses the unsolved task on a higher historical stage. It tests anew not only the stability of the existing regime, but also the ability of the proletariat to replace them. The result of this test will automatically have a decisive significance for our appraisal of the modern epoch as the epoch of proletarian revolution. If, contrary to all probabilities, the October Revolution fails during the course of the present war, or immediately thereafter, to find its continuation in any of the advanced countries, and if, on the contrary, the proletariat is thrown back everywhere and on all fronts, then we shall have to pose the question of revising our conception of the present epoch and its driving forces. In that case, it would be a question not of slapping a copybook label on the USSR or the Stalinist gang, but of reevaluating the world historical perspective for the next decades, if not centuries. We have entered the epoch of social revolution and socialist society, or on the contrary, have we entered the epoch of socialist revolution and socialist society, or on the contrary, the epoch of the declining society of totalitarian bureaucracy? This is a continuation of the quote. The twofold error of schematists like Hugo Urbans and Bruno R. consists, first, in that they proclaim this latter regime as having been already finally installed. Second, in that they declare it a prolonged transitional state of society between capitalism and socialism. Yet it is absolutely self-evident that if the international proletariat, as a result of the experience of our entire epoch and the current war, proves incapable of becoming the master of society, this would signify the foundering of all hope for a socialist revolution, for it is impossible to expect any more favorable conditions for it. In any case, no one foresees them now, or is able to characterize them. End quote. With these pronouncements, Trotsky turned a corner in his thinking so abruptly as to bring Trotsky into violent collision with the main pillars of the theory of Stalinism Trotsky had long and stoutly upheld. The doctrine that Russia was still a worker state because the bourgeoisie had not yet become the ruling class was essentially exploded. It is possible for Russia, or other countries, to be ruled by a new exploiting class. The doctrine that Russia was still a worker state because the bourgeoisie had not yet become the ruling class was essentially exploded. It is possible for Russia, or other countries, to be ruled by a new exploiting class which is neither proletarian nor bourgeois. The doctrine that the maintenance of nationalized property proved that the Stalinist regime was a worker state, however degenerated, was similarly exploded. It is possible for nationalized property to be the economic foundation for the rule of a new class. The conception of a new ruling class commanding society which is neither capitalist nor socialist, a conception not long before derided by Trotsky, was not a revision of Marxism at all. Quote, Marxists have formulated an incalculable number of times the alternative, either socialism or a return to barbarism, end quote. And this conception does not of itself mean the end of socialism or the fight for it. Quote, an alternative of this kind, has, enormous importance in agitation because in its light the necessity for socialist revolution appears most graphically, end quote. It is true to be sure that Trotsky endeavored at the same time to reaffirm Trotsky's old theory. It was no longer so easy. Having insisted that Russia remained a worker state because the rule of the bourgeoisie had not been restored and nationalized property still prevailed, he now conceded that the worker state could be utterly destroyed even if the bourgeoisie did not come to power and even if property remained nationalized. The Russian state, Trotsky argued, remained proletarian because the Stalinist bureaucracy had no prospect of retaining control of it. Quote, its inglorious downfall, end quote, might be a matter of, quote, a few years or even a few months, end quote, Trotsky said in 1939, almost a quarter of a century ago, end parenthesis. Whereas Trotskyists had the perspective that in all probability the October Revolution would, quote, find its continuation, end quote, in advanced countries, quote, during the course of the present war or immediately thereafter, end quote. To determine the nature of a social order by appraising the prospects for political success of its upholders and its opponents is an extraordinary procedure for a Marxist. The two are closely related, but in exactly reverse order. The nature of cancer is not established by the success of medical science in finding the cure for that cancer or the speed with which that cancer is found. The nature of the atomic bomb is not determined by the use to which the atomic bomb is put, by the appalling consequences of the atomic bomb's use, or by society's success in controlling or destroying the atomic bomb. Marx determined the class nature of capitalism by an analysis of capitalism's social anatomy, starting with the commodity. the validity, parenthesis, or invalidity, end parenthesis, of this analysis is not to be determined by the conclusions he drew from it about the prospects for a socialist revolution in Europe of 1848 or later. By reducing the question of the nature of the Stalinist state to a matter of the prospects for success of the bureaucracy and of the socialist revolution in the period Trotsky indicated, Trotsky effectively abandoned the essential elements of the theory of the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote. The course of the war undermined another of Trotsky's doctrines and drove Trotsky to another radical revision. Before the war, Trotsky had unremittingly attacked Stalinism for Stalinism's theory of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote. This theory was to Trotsky the central axis of the bureaucracy's thought, from which it derived, or with which were inseparably connected all the bureaucracy's errors, crimes, and betrayals of the revolution. If on Russian soil, the theory of socialism in one country might still play a positive role insofar as it maintained or defended state property, abroad it played an unequivocally reactionary role in that it defended capitalist private property. In Spain, as has already been noted, quote, this is on the whole, quote, that is, on the soil of a bourgeois regime, end quote, Stalin, quote, executes the function of Hitler, end quote, wrote Trotsky only 2 years before the war. In the first months of the war, it should have been clear this analysis of Stalinism proved completely indefensible, and it was clear enough to Trotsky to end any attempt to defend it. Quote, on the soil of a bourgeois regime, end quote, that is, the part of Poland which was occupied by the Russian army at the start of the war, Stalin did not, quote, execute the function of Hitler, end quote, within the meaning of Trotsky's phrase. Instead, Trotsky destroyed the power of bourgeois and landowner, abolished private property, and set up the same economic, political, social regime as the Russian. It was an inconvenient turn of events. Given the theory he would not disavow, Trotsky had no choice but to acknowledge that Stalin's course in Poland, parenthesis, as later in the Baltic lands, end parenthesis, was, quote, revolutionary in character, quote, the expropriation of the expropriators, end quote, that, quote, the statification of property in the occupied territories is in itself a progressive measure, end quote. This acknowledgment placed Trotsky squarely in the center of a dilemma from which Trotsky was not allowed the time to extricate himself. A few weeks after acknowledging the basic social changes introduced in Poland by Stalin, Trotsky introduced a new modification of his theory. Quote, some voices cry out, if we continue to recognize the USSR as a worker state, we will have to establish a new category, the counter-revolutionary worker state. End quote. Well, why not? He continued in an article on the 18th of October. The trade unions of France and Britain and the United States were counter-revolutionary since, quote, the trade unions of France and Britain and the United States support completely the counter-revolutionary politics of their bourgeoisie, Why is it impossible to employ the same method with the counter-revolutionary workers' state, end quote. Trotsky. The, quote, new category, end quote, did not alleviate Trotsky's position. The term, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote, had been applied to the reformist unions in the West precisely because the reformist unions in the West, quote, defended private property, end quote, and refused to, quote, expropriate the expropriators, end quote. The, quote, counter-revolutionary worker state, end quote, however, was now acting in Poland in exactly and fundamentally opposite sense by carrying out measures that were, quote, revolutionary in character, quote, the expropriation of the expropriators, end quote, end quote. The dimensions of this, quote, revolutionary expropriation, end quote, could not be known to Trotsky. Only after his death were they extended far beyond Poland, nowhere under the auspices of the proletariat, everywhere under the aegis, direction, and control of the, quote, counter-revolutionary workers' state, end quote. Yet he saw enough in 1939 and wrote enough to indicate that his central indictment of Stalinism, for Stalinism's theory of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, was no longer relevant. The bureaucracy was showing, while it remained, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote, the bureaucracy could and would carry out a fundamental revolution against the bourgeoisie abroad, but without the working class and against the workers, indeed in Trotsky's own words, in order to convert them into its own semi-slaves. The counter-revolutionary proletarian revolution against the bourgeoisie and the working class was a concept which not even the much burdened dialectic could sustain. It was too much for the back of a theory which held that a regime under which workers and peasants enjoyed not a shred of economic or political power, but were pitilessly exploited, was nevertheless a worker state because it was not a bourgeois state. The unique nature of Stalinist society's ruling class, and of Stalinist society's relations, and of Stalinist society's true international significance, both for capitalist society and for socialism, on these crucial problems of our time, Trotsky found and offered promising clues to an understanding in the last polemical fight of his life. The Assassin's Act soon ended all chance of Trotsky pursuing the clues to their end. The End. This piece was titled 1939, Trotsky and His Critics by Max Shachtman. It's from 1962, published in the journal Survey, which I believe had some names after it, like Survey, Journal of like Eastern European something, blah, blah, blah. I think. I might be wrong. It might be a different journal. But anyway, Survey, number 41, April 1962.